Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you for tuning in on Spotify, iTunes, here on the channel. Most likely that's the most popular place that people are still finding me. It's good that we could meet after this long weekend in Japan. It was supposed to be, this was the long weekend for the Olympics, but we all know how that went. And it's been amazing. I stayed away from the drink. For the most part, it can be tempting. You're like, it's a holiday, but then the good times keep killing you. So I didn't do that. Stayed on track, went to the gym, got ahead on everything. I actually feel really amped up heading into the week here, and had some interesting interactions. Made a great vlog video that was like more in the Curb Your Enthusiasm, sort of like a comedic style thing, which I would like to do. And given greater freedom on the channel, I could be a little bit more unleashed once I'm not so bound by professional restrictions of the job that I do. But yeah, no drinking, mostly staying on course. And I was struck by actually an interaction I had on a video recently. So to start, I'll say this, that there's this author who, time immemorial, everyone who knows, who listens to me for any period of time, should know that I like Peter F. Hamilton. And Peter F. Hamilton's most recent book, it's called Salvation Lost. I won't go into any sort of spoilers. I know how people love their space opera, and I wouldn't want to ruin that for them. But one of the interesting characteristics of this book when I was first reading it is I thought that there were all these spelling mistakes that were made at the beginning, because he would refer to a character in the book. He would say, "Hear idea," and "see" is listening. And I thought, what is that? Like, here? Like that? I think he meant, I guess they make mistakes sometimes. I found errors before in spelling, and it was HIR. I was like, he must have meant her, but he put an I there. And then when he wrote see understands, SIE, I thought, okay, so that's like a mistake that's been made with she. But then as I continued to read, I realized that there's this offshoot within the society that exists in the book that they're called the Utopials. And the Utopials, I didn't realize that this is actually an idea borrowed from an Ursula K. Le Guin novel. They're on this sort of, they're gender cyclical. So they for a period of time will be male, and for another period of time, they'll be female. They actually go through these different cycles. And it's this kind of egalitarian idea, that they've now removed that as something that the sexes are at each other's throats because everybody shares that characteristic. And then that these pronouns they actually exist. So when I looked them up, I was like, oh, these exist today. Like people who are now identifying differently in their genders. And he was incorporating that into the lore of the book, I guess you might say, the kind of the backstory and world building that he's doing. And I thought that was so fascinating. What an interesting way for me to come across that idea. And I've always found it fascinating in his books, his kind of like far-seeing idea of like gender and sexuality. Super, like highly sexual books, like the amount of like adult material that you find there. I think he was actually criticized in his early books for the amount of sexuality that was there, but it never felt cheap. And it seemed to me like he really was approaching these ideas as in how, if a society changed technologically that allowed for these kind of things, what would be the social implications of that? And so I've always enjoyed his exploration of those ideas. And you have these characters who will, like, whether it's gender or age, because they can rejuvenate themselves as well, people will tailor their experience, their age experience, to what is appropriate. Say, for example, the job that they're doing. So if they're in a position of power, say they're like a chief executive officer of a business, then in that case, they might age themselves just enough, or allow themselves age enough to give themselves a sort of like dignified look that would demand a certain degree of respect. Then you have people who they can switch their genders freely, and you'll have people for like political reasons. They feel that, you know, beauty is really sought after in, you know, whatever world that it is that they're on, so they're like a woman for a period of time, and then, you know, classically in the other direction, women will become men. There's like, you want to talk about gender fluidity, he really explores this idea, and I find it fascinating. And to my mind, I really do think like the self is composed of the mind. It's not as much as, I don't think that there's any kind of debate in terms of like, what are your genitalia? I think the research will show that you really are defined by this thing between your ears, this like brain and how it functions. And it'll be predisposed to one way or another. But the idea of a sexual spectrum is something that I think people are rapidly awakening to, which as well is supported by science. And I like this idea of a world that, the interesting thing is that it's a topic that becomes obsessed about, but like my idea is that it's obsessed about needlessly. That's the whole problem, is that if a society were evolved, these things wouldn't matter. And that classic kind of thing the comedians might say, where it's like, if they're not hurting you and if it's nothing to do with you, then why do you care? And it shows a sort of like preoccupation that we have in other people's business and how we feel threatened by, or that it impacts us, that somebody's gender or sexuality is really irritating to us. Now, where I understand that people take issue with this is that sometimes I think you would agree that our belief systems at their extremities become the same sort of monstrous thing. They become rigid, unbending, and the whole idea of open-mindedness is excluded at either end. If you are hyper-progressive, it means that that's at the cost of considering how things that traditionally make sense, like immutable virtues, could still be in our society. But then at the opposite end of that, where you are incredibly if you are rigid and traditionally you would say conservative, then that's at the cost of not allowing more inclusive thoughts, more explorative thoughts, more openness. I have always hated the term liberal or conservative because it presupposes the idea that a person, a human, is any one thing, which we're absolutely not. I mean, you go into a psychological discussion of our minds and how you have a narrative voice and a reactive voice, this voice that's, you might call it like the reptilian brain, that's like fed by emotion and immediate gratification. And then you have this narrative voice that's telling you, you could plan for this and you could do this kind of thing, and it'll make your future have a better outcome for you. And that even there, you can see that the fact that we talk about having a conscious, a self, where we have a conscience that speaks to us, like Jiminy Cricket is embodied in a Disney film or whatever other, form of media, entertainment, literature that embodies conscience, that we are aware that our actions have weight to them and we have this voice telling us what to do. We are not in any way kind of a singular voice in our minds. We're composed of all these different voices in our heads that are, vying for control, if you will. Now, I'm the sort of person who would like to see a world that allows for greater and greater and greater expressiveness and a willingness for people to think that because they don't understand that kind of expressiveness, that it doesn't need to be opposed to them. It's more that classic idea of things that we don't understand, we are threatened by, and if we understood them better, then there would be nothing to be scared of. But what I do take issue with are, as I was saying, at either extremity, you have the same sort of rigidity of thought. And I absolutely cannot stand, and would stand up to fight at any moment that it arose that I felt like I was being confronted by this, is any kind of thought policing. And this happens with people who have become so hyper-progressive and have tried to create safer and safer spaces for people that they become exhaustively constrictive in propriety. And I've talked about this actually not so long ago on the podcast, talking about the 1950s was kind of an embodiment of this for the first time. It was kind of the first time that you could have like what was it like? There's so much that you can borrow from 1984, like thought crime, that there was kind of an accepted rules and there was propriety in the way that you behaved. There was this unspoken system of behavior that meant that everybody was good and everybody followed the rules and everybody blended in and nobody got offended. But it was so appropriate only to this system that had so much yet to develop that anybody trying to express themselves in anything other than the set accepted, inclusive set of rules, inclusive for whoever defined them, that they were going to find themselves thrown out. They were going to be considered antisocial, hippies, this kind of thing. And I see that kind of resurgence. It's weird because, like I say, it's expressed by both like what you would traditionally call left thinking and right thinking in terms of political alliance. And now where you have people, as I say, who are trying to be so inclusive that they don't realize that they're committing the same sort of crimes that you would have in an Orwellian book, for example, the topic that I'll go on about now, and why this is so important and why we do not, at the cost of inclusion, start to reduce our freedom of thought, where certain words start to become outlawed. And in 1984, this system by ingsoc, whatever the presiding, the party in power at the time is doing, is that they're saying that these certain words are limited because they're unhealthy for you. But really what it is the inability to express yourself. And if you control language, and the more and more that you limit language, the less and less you can have new ideas. And you can do the things that progressives profess to want to accomplish, and they're actually limiting that by becoming constrictive on the way that you can express yourself. For example, in the book, words are removed that have any sort of, and this is like the very like case in point definition of what can happen if you become too progressive and create these hyper safe spaces, and you shouldn't say this word and you shouldn't say that word, or you're going to offend someone. It's that you can no longer have expressions of negativity unto the point that you can no longer speak out against that which oppresses you. So, for example, in the book, they have that you cannot say negative words, and that's non-good, I believe. I could look it up now, but I'll ruin the flow. Non-good and double plus non-good is the way to express, what is most abhorrent. There's a fantastic word, abhorrent, because it restricts the way that you think. Now, anticipating the sort of criticism that people would say, well, there's certain words we absolutely should not say that have historical precedent to them. Certainly, there's like words of oppression that have been used on people for time eternal. And I can understand where words that should not be spoken are then related to a historical significance. But then I would invite people to, as they look for ways that they don't want to hurt people, or what they want to be more inclusive, or they want to be more thoughtful of their language, is this something that has any sort of historical baggage associated with it that you should have any concern? Or are you now sacrificing freedoms for safety? Just a little bit of freedom, just a little bit of the way that you can think, just a little bit of expressiveness, just a little bit of creativity at the cost of safety. Really, really consider the words that you start to include in that. And I think even the most egregious, my point is made even stronger in that often these words that have been so long oppressive to certain people, for example, the Black community, they've retaken these words by using them. Now, it's not that everybody can use them, but the point there is that they're used in a way that then empowers the group that put them down. They weren't removed entirely. That's kind of repurposing and repossessing the world's power. I think you also get the same sort of like feminists even have this in like usage of certain words that, like the vagina monologues is supposed to be like this word that, not that this, I don't know what kind of prudish people are like offended by that word, but that they repossess that word in all of their poetry to say that there's nothing wrong with saying it, and they can do what they would like with it to feel comfortable. So even these words that I would respect the fact that for my usage, what's in my dialectic, whatever you want to call it, however I would speak, I won't use that word, but I would be eternally on guard for people telling you to stop using certain types of language, because the word itself, a word is nothing other than a sound. It's the spirit of the thing that is used. It is the context of it. It's the expressional meaning of that word that really has power. And you can see an expressional control in someone saying that you shouldn't make this sound. I mean, it's only relevant to the people that are trying to stop it because they even speak that language. I see this kind of thing, of course, when you don't speak another language and somebody might be speaking ill about you and you don't understand. You're actually immune to the word because you don't understand what it means. To try and prevent someone from speaking is an expression of power, I would say far more insidious than what can often be the case with the use of a word. Because with the use of a word, it totally depends on who's saying it. But with the restriction of saying it, it's always the same thing. It's always someone saying that they're trying to make a space safer, be more inclusive. But I don't believe that everyone who says that realizes the full implications of what they're doing, what they're trying to censor. Censorship at its core is a horrifying thing. And what it's doing is removing your ability to think, as it removes your ability to express yourself. So as I say, anticipating that there are certain words that people shouldn't even say given a historical context, well, I would say that even that requires a definitive look at it, because then even as you say that, you realize that there's some nuance, because then there's still certain groups that will say that word and it's acceptable. So I do not know nearly, I'd welcome somebody to write me an email to say that this is the forbidden word that you cannot say under any circumstances whatsoever. But I'm firmly entrenched in the idea from these kind of dystopic future warnings that you get from people like Orwell to be so on guard for people calling themselves who appear in the guise of innocence and inclusion at the cost of restriction. I think that you do, to some degree, to live in a modern society, sacrifice a certain degree of freedoms for safety. Take, for example, when you go to somewhere like like Thailand. Now, there's an incredibly free country, especially to do with their roads. But the likelihood that you're going to step out onto a road and get run over by a motorbike is really high. So I think that there are certain situations, because nothing ever exists in absolutes in our society, that yes, we are going to sacrifice some degree of our freedoms for safety or for order, but we should be always on guard, always in conversation about how we want to progress these values that we have, and really examine when we say that we're doing something for virtuous reasons. Perhaps at an outset, that's what you intend, but then what does it lead to? So that was something I really enjoyed thinking about recently, because it was a subscriber that I've had for years. And in my most recent vlog, I used the word bitch. Bitch is a word that's used, its origins exist in the name of a female dog, but the way it has no historical baggage. Like you can call somebody a bitch, you can call a guy a bitch, you can call a girl a bitch. And we use it as a derogatory word to criticize somebody who's, we might all have different, as I say, there's sort of like different personal expressions of language. What it might mean to me is a little bit different from you. But I would say it's for somebody who's being entitled. I often have a sense when I use that word, it's somebody who's being whiny. That's kind of how the entitlement sort of ties into it. That it's somebody portraying in themselves a behavior that is less becoming of a person who really takes command and accountability for their life. Or here's another way that I would say, I think that it's really, really good for people who are petty. That's another way that I would say I really like to use the word bitch. Don't be a little bitch, because that's somebody wheedling you with some small detail, and that's just bitchy. But the person in my comment section said, you may want to check yourself on the usage of that word. And it horrifies me, because I know that this person has a kind heart and they have only the best intentions of the world, but they could take a word as innocuous as so completely free of any sort of historical significance and want to add that into a group of censorship is horrifying to me. That is not someone reflecting on, you do that, you take away bitch, then what? We shouldn't say asshole. We shouldn't say negative words. We should start to begin to speak like Newspeak, saying non-good or double plus non-good, until we lose the ability to take a stand, take nuance, take context into consideration when it is that we speak, until it becomes entirely black and white, which nothing is. That's the whole point of why we need speech to be nuanced and complex and open and uncomfortably expressive. One of my favorite authors, maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole, but I really like his style as it relates to this subject, is the guy who wrote Fight Club. And man, when you read some of the stuff that he's gone into and some of the stuff that he most respects, it's that human experience, what he's identifying when I've listened to him, is so messy. And the way that we're able to express some of the really messed up stuff that happens to us is unsettling. It's uncomfortable. And that comes out in a language that people may want to censor, but then it's like you're censoring parts of human experience. I said, it's one way, it's a kind of thought control. It's like experience control. It's almost a negation of the multitude of experiences that people can have if we're not allowed to express it with raw, uncomfortable language. He wrote this book called Choked, which is about sex addiction. Obviously, there was Fight Club. When he was talking about, is it something Polonyuk? I'm going to look this up real quick. Fight Club author. I want to see his name. It's actually like a really Fight Club author. What's his name? Here we go. Chuck Polonyuk. He was talking about like these writing seminars that he had with people and the sort of stuff that was coming out of them, and it was like raw and uncomfortable. But I have to say that some of the best media I have ever been exposed to has been raw, uncomfortable media, because it shines a light on things that are totally a part of our experience, but are difficult for us to confront, are difficult for us to express and be comfortable expressing. But all of that does to us is it forces us underground, because this is not something like, whether it's words that we use to express ourselves or experiences that we've had, this is a part of us. And to deny it is to repress it. And to repress it is to turn it into some really, really, really ugly neuroses. One of my favorite movies that I've ever watched is called The Cell. And it's about this serial killer who's had like just a horrendous upbringing. And it's not to condone what it is that he's done, but Jennifer Lopez, also starring Vince Vaughn, goes into the mind of the serial killer in this movie, and it reveals in him that he's had these competing parts of his self, and a large history of abuse that he endured that very likely turned him into the sort of monster that you're viewing. Incredible director of that movie as well. One of the most standout movies I have ever watched in my entire life. Beautiful in its darkness, uncomfortable to the extreme. And many times I watched it multiple times in the theaters. And when I went in and watched it, I kept recommending it to people. This is something I have to understand, that our tastes are different. I'm not saying that nuance can't exist in taste as well, because not everyone is twisted as I am in terms of like what they find fascinating. Several people walked out of the theater when I took them to watch that movie. But it really, really is absolutely incredible. And the more that we censor and the more that we limit discussion, the more that we limit parts of ourselves. I think that would be the sort of grand point that I'm trying to make here. And the great irony of it is that what you're trying to do as you censor is make someone feel more comfortable and included, but actually it's having the opposite effect, because it's allowing for a lesser and lesser expression of all the many faceted ways that we exist as individuals. There is greater freedom, there is more inclusion, without censorship, without saying that there is a certain way to speak, without saying that there is a certain sexuality to be, without saying that gender is, well, let's say genitalia is one thing, gender is another. And I find that irony is this great source of humor to me, because isn't that funny that it's these people who want to be more inclusive who are actually becoming more exclusive as they attempt to thought police and word police each other. So an endlessly interesting topic. And I have no ill will towards the individual who left me the comment, but I completely disagree with them. I will never stop saying the word bitch. It made me want to use it more. I will look for more words that are, derogatory and nasty and cut to like further and further expressions of something that I don't understand, because that means that I will not be naive. I'll have a full breadth of experience. When I come to a situation, I'll be able to color it in a way that's vibrant, emotional, and fully realized, and not double plus non-good. So this is a little bit late for me to arrive to this now, but of course, I could have mentioned at the beginning, if you want to get your questions answered here, or you've just had some, ruminations floating around in your head and you want to send them off my way, do get a hold of me at davetrippin@gmail.com, and we answer them in the second half of the podcast. And that's what we're going to be doing now. I'm going to load up these emails, and we're going to get a little bit more Japan-centric, and we're going to head out of this issue of thought police, propriety, exclusion, and inclusion. Into the questions we go. Hey, Dave. I'm Joshua. I'm in California. Cool. I always love to hear where you guys are writing in from. That's always interesting for me. I'm 21 years old. Whoa. Right on. Got your whole life ahead of you. I'm 21 years old and have not been to college purposefully. Interesting. I can understand in the States that the cost of that can sometimes be prohibitive. I've been staying with relatives for the past few years, and they recently moved to an area with no jobs for miles. I wanted to know, what is the basic qualifications for teaching in Japan? From your experience, how does it operate, finding a place to stay once there? How hard is it working in an environment not knowing Japanese? I'm really considering this as an option. Okay, Joshua, not sure how I should refer to you. So basically, much harder with no qualifications, naturally, as well as it should be. You should have some qualifications. I'd recommend at the bare minimum that you got to get yourself something like probably a TESOL. And even then, the sort of like work visa that you can apply for is limited. It has to be a specialist in humanities. And that would allow you to work in eikaiwas. There are certain eikaiwas that would hire you with that work visa. And so that's the best that I can offer you at that point, is to work for an eikaiwa specialist in humanities. And potentially once you're here, that work visa allows you to work in it's one of the most, call it flexible, that you'd be able to get into things like a server technician or something with IT. So that's what I would recommend for you. This says, hi, I am Ahmad, and I'm from a tiny country in South America called Guyana. I was told that JET doesn't take applications for individuals in my country. So I'm wondering, if I do manage to get a visa and travel on my own to Japan, can I apply for a teaching job that will sponsor a work visa? Become enamored with Japan, checking out the videos. That's awesome. So what I would say for you, sir, is that you'd want to come over like you're suggesting. I think this is a good idea, the come over on a work visa that is like a working holiday visa, if you can get over with that. And then opportunities do open up for you there where you can just look at any kind of job board and be able to find yourself supplementary work, transfer into something like specialist in humanities, something like that. I'm not saying that it is easy, quite the contrary. It's going to be hard for you. Given that situation that you find yourself in there. Now, you say that you're from a tiny country. Perhaps you have a degree. I don't know if you have a degree. If you have a degree in something, of course, that educational background is going to work for you. But kind of like what I was saying to Joshua from the question before, you get here, you get your foot in the door with sort of an entry-level job of anything. You're probably going to have a specialist in humanities visa. I would definitely recommend for people in this situation as well that you want to be looking at something like a major city center. I mean, if you're kind of like me, goof out in the countryside here where you're working for years, and then you've gotten yourself kind of a history and a reputation on your resume of somebody who's taught for a while, then you can do that. You can find the teaching jobs in the countryside, but that's unless you're like high level professional level, there's not much else to do in the countryside aside from that. So for people who are coming over, I would say it's even more imperative for you to come over and get yourself situated in a city, because of course there's so many more opportunities that you're going to find there. So that's my thoughts for you, sir. All right, next one is, hey, I'm Daniel. I graduated high school. I live in the United States my entire life. Native speaker of the language. Cool. For quite some time, I'm very interested to come to East Asia, preferably Japan, in order to teach English. I've never heard that before. I feel that I'm stuck at a crossroad when I'm getting ready to take on the biggest financial burden of my life, looking to a 4-year university here in the States. Yeah, that's really brutal for you guys, isn't it? I mean, it's expensive in Canada, but it just doesn't even compare, right? There's no comparison to the cost investment that it takes. I'm having my doubts about going to college right now, especially with the current global situation, as well as being a college athlete and losing eligibility. Not sure how you'd lose eligibility. So I was hoping to get some form of guidance or insight into what kind of recommendations you would have about trying to get some form of TEFL certification and try to live and teach over in Japan for at least 2 years. So what I would say to you is that where it doesn't sound like something that you necessarily want to do in the long term, anybody with a degree can teach in Japan. So the better thing to do, and a lot of interesting people that I correspond with currently that enjoy the channel, speak to me, talk to me about how they may come over and what they would transition into, is to really explore how you could, if teaching is not the thing, which for many it wouldn't in the long term be, then what could you do? What skill set could you develop that would then be transferable to something else in Japan if you wanted to be here for a longer period of time? So what I'm thinking about marketing in business. I'm thinking about digital marketing. I'm thinking about IT skills, whether that's networking or software design, like all of these different skill sets. You could come over, teach, be developing your language, but then your degree is in, communications or IT or business marketing or business, some other facet of business. And you could then go on to do something else, which would be fantastic in terms of flexibility once you arrive. That's really what I strongly encourage people to do, and what I was never prepared with. Like, one of the things that annoys me so much about my experience in high school was it was kind of like you're good at math and you're good at science, and so you're either going to become an engineer or nothing. It was like as soon as you said that you were like, I don't know if I can be an engineer, it's like, well, then you're just you're an art student. And we all know what happens to art students. You basically get your major in whatever thing it is, and you have to go on to do a master's in that, or you're sunk. There's nothing that you're going to do aside from kind of like claw the way up like I have, using that base level BA to get into somewhere like I have here. And then you discover after the fact the sort of things that you're really, really interested in. But it would be far better at the time, the earlier that you could specialize into a different field that would give you flexibility, will be a massive, massive benefit to you. And I really encourage that for people. That nothing wrong with teaching. It's awesome. Get your foot in the door, maybe do it for a while. If it turns out that you're an amazing teacher and you want to keep doing that, keep doing it. But really examine, and we don't know these things unless we examine them. What jobs could I do? Where nobody ever said to me, do you know that there's like 50,000 different business jobs that are available if you only went into marketing or communications? Nobody said a word of that to me, but seek and you shall find. So I really do think you should look at the departments of universities and go, what are all the different vocations that come out of this department? What are all the vocations that come out of this? And there should be a real concerted, strong, focused effort to really examine your options that you can have before you get to or are thinking about doing something seriously at university and dropping, the 50,000 Americans, 60,000 upwards, whatever it is that you're going to have to pay to be able to do this. I think I hit lap on my timer here, so I have to be careful that I don't suddenly speak for way over time. So that's what I would recommend. Really explore your options that you could then transition into were you to make your way over here. Those are my thoughts for you. And believe it or not, I've not gotten that many emails recently. We have just cleared the emails. So anybody who is interested, please, as I say, do get a hold of me at davetrippin@gmail.com, and you'll end up in the conversation here on the podcast. So that actually, it's kind of cool because that gives us, a little extra time to just go wherever it is that we want to go. I thought it was really cool. I thought I was talking to some friends too recently. It's this idea that humans, how we're all doing the same thing, and it's expressed at the same time, paradoxically, entirely different, yet always the same. So the example that I want to talk about recently that really blew my mind was I was watching this documentary, and it was talking about the Flint water crisis. Now, when I first heard about the Flint water crisis, I thought that it was that something basically happened in the groundwater or wherever they were extracting their water from, and that made it toxic. And that was what people were suffering from, that it was kind of a force of nature that was the issue that caused the problem. Lightning struck a pipe somewhere, and then that caused soil to erode because of flooding after a thunderstorm, and then the water became toxic. No, it's not the case at all. It is no laughing matter. What actually happened is the town, I don't know what level of political strength he is at, but the guy responsible for how the water is gotten to that town had a business venture where if he built this new pipeline as opposed to using the one that they had currently, he would be able to make a ton of money. But what it would mean is that during the time that they were building the alternative pipeline, that they would have to get their water from a different source. And the source that they chose from was this horrendous, crazy source that was filled with all kind of toxicants like lead, and you were gonna have a bad time if you were any sort of person who was going to get your water from that as a drinking source. And lo and behold, as soon as people started to take water from this as a source for their everyday needs, they were getting brutally sick from lead poisoning, just all kinds of death and suffering inflicted on these people for the greed of this governor that was in place in Flint. And get this is how there's no bounds, the sort of pettiness of this evil, where it was also impacting I can't remember I think it was GM had a parts service, or basically they were developing parts. They had a factory for the car parts in Flint. The water was so bad that was being delivered to that factory that it was damaging the car parts. Now, the outcry from the corporate source was enough to get the ear of the governor that he then redirected the water, or at least a portion of it, so it would be clean, but only to the GM. And it just shows how, for time eternal, for those maneuvering for power and wealth, that human life is so cheap. So it ended up being that for car parts, it was worth redirecting the water, but not for the lives of the people who would have to drink it. And that blew me away. And what is this? Why does this relate to what I think about in terms of a grand scale of human behavior? Is that if you listen to the recent podcast, you know that I've been listening, or I've not been listening. I've been reading the biography of Caesar. And it's so interesting to me, the behaviors at that time, that if you were in the political at that class at that time, it was all about maneuvering for power. And it had nothing to do other than with your own self-aggrandizement to becoming more wealthy, to becoming more powerful. And it would always be cloaked in the benefit of the Republic and others as would be socially acceptable. But it's always the same thing. People want money and they want power. Now, I'm not saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't believe that. We have historical evidence of many people through history who, with great power, were incredibly noble. Actually contradicts that very, very common phrase, which is really, really interesting. We can be very powerful and not become corrupt by it. Such people did exist, but a lot of us do. And it's so striking to me because when I made these connections between all these like political machinations of like what I see going on around me now and how these were people back in Rome, different technologically, but no different at all 2,000 years ago in the sort of behaviors that they displayed in their search for self-enrichment, and that will always be that until we perhaps get to what would be known as a post-scarcity society, because then, well, there's no need for it. Like, why would you get richer when you can literally have anything? Now, maybe that's naive again. Maybe even though we can have anything, maybe there's another sort of accumulation of wealth that I am unaware of that we would then evolve into, that would then express that same human behavior all over again, but now on this different scale technologically. But it really is, whether it's now or 2,000 years ago, it's just humans doing really shitty things to each other to make a few extra dollars. And it was why I found the whole Flint scenario so brutal, like the banality of evil, is that those people who are in that position, that guy making that call that's going to poison thousands of people, kill people who are poor and impoverished and already getting the worst hand dealt to them that society possibly could, is that he's a millionaire. And in the grand scale of probably what he's going to earn from this is that it's like another million. Maybe it's 2 million. Maybe it's even 10 million. But in terms of like social mobility, where that places him on the pyramid of the planet, the people who are in the next like power range of wherever it is that he's at are still, even given that sacrifice to your moral character, miles like above, unreachable, away from him. So it's like you've given up so much of what it means to be a decent human being to gain so little at the cost of human life. You've progressed your power by this incremental inch forward, but you would do that. It's this other interesting discussion that I think you could have about how, because you are wealthy, because you are powerful, it does not mean you are intelligent at all. It means you can be making these totally horrible mistakes. And I mean, I'm not saying that you can't be intelligent and simultaneously malevolent. You could be an intelligent, malevolent person, but I think you can be so stupidly malevolent. And a lot of these people who find themselves in these abusive positions, it wasn't because they particularly made right choices to arrive there and they're now abusing it because they're flush with power and they can't handle it. I think it's that they bumble through to that position in life. It could be inherited. It could be a series of events that kind of chaotically leads them into that position. There is, I think, a degree which most people, I think, would be like uncomfortable admitting, a huge amount of fated progression to our lives. I mean, if you only look at the amount our lives are dictated by which country you were born in, like what is your life going to be like if you were born in some incredibly poor country in, I don't know, like Eastern Europe or sub-Saharan desert, tribal people, compared to you were born into like a history of wealth and the Rockefeller family. Like, how do you think those two people's lives are going to go, regardless of how intelligent they are? It is fated. And in that way, where I think a lot of people, they have this, there's this sense of, I think it even has a name associated with it, that you feel like because you're powerful or because you're wealthy, that all of that has come deservingly to you, that it has only come as a result of that you fought tooth and nail to end up in that position. And no matter what, it was at odds with the universe that you could reach that level of success, when far more often than not, it is usually the case that it was sort of served up to you on a platter and you barely did anything to achieve that thing. It should also, it gets clouded by the fact that it is so fascinating to us, stories of people who succeed in the face of adversity. And so they get held up as the example of what is probably more common, but it's not true. There's all these people who are famous, who came from nothing, and enriched themselves through very like fair channels. But there's far more this like unspoken silent majority of people who are reaching these levels of wealth and success and power that kind of dropped there, were dropped on their head, looked around, didn't even know how they got there. And that's simply the way that it is. But I would think then it should also give hope, to turn this conversation into a different direction, perhaps, to people who feel like there's no way out and that they've got a raw deal and that the universe is against them, where I don't think that it's against you. It's just that people in those odds are fighting against a fated scale, where if you want to get out, this is the example I could give for, if you have $100,000 to invest, then think of your potential compared to somebody who has to make that first $100,000. It's massive. Money begets money. Power begets power. So you are having to overcome such a degree of pressure against you that people in more privileged situations are not. And that's me totally acknowledging in my relative scale that I have massive benefits afforded me to have simply come from a family that was, I think you would say, classically middle class. Like there was, my dad was like the major, my dad primarily supported the family financially. My mom dedicated herself to raising us, but also she worked a couple of different jobs, like at a grocery store as a cashier, a couple of different things to contribute. She was not satisfied unless, doing something in addition to even raising us. But there were many things that I was limited from. For example, I did end up going to a private school, but it was because I got a bursary, a sports scholarship to go there. And there were times that, for example, I was doing very well with the rowing program that I belonged to part 2, and our crew had done so well that there was this opportunity. They sometimes, if a crew is good enough, go to England to compete in what is called the Royal Henley Cup, which is like amounts to basically the Worlds for high school rowing. And my parents told me, they were like, Dave, there's no other way that we can put this, but like we just can't afford that. We can't do it. And I was like, I get it. I totally understand. I was like, the fact that I did any of the things that I did in that school, I was very much aware that I was like the odd man out at that school. You had kids, who were donating whole buildings to the school, kind of like wealth levels at this place. I was not that level. But then, this is actually a charming story. It's really nice that I told that to my coach. I said, I got to be honest with you, coach. I can't do this. Like everybody else is all excited to go, but I can't afford it. And he was this old crotchety Irish guy. And he was like, oh, Dave, now don't you worry. We'll sort that out. And I'm quite certain that it's like one of the families I was incredibly close to until this day, that they bailed me out and they actually paid for me to go, which I'm eternally grateful for them. Without them ever totally altruistic, they never let on who it was. They never told me, but I have a feeling. But more the point was that certainly I come from some benefit that to be in a first world country and to come from a middle class family, you're like, you're in the top like 90% at that level. But then you compare me to somebody who had any sort of like business success, say it was like a family that ran a small successful business, that's like a universe away from me. And then them compared to like more established wealth, like it's the scale I think people don't appreciate today of how much wealthier. Like we look at celebrities and I think we look at them as a sort of like, oh, it's an untouchable lifestyle. But the distortion with celebrities is that so much of their wealth is rooted in their fame. Their fame is a kind of wealth. It gives them sort of social credit. But in terms of actual money, I mean, there's just infinitely more people that have way more money than movie stars. And we don't even realize that because we're so like laser focused on the sort of like mass consciousness awareness for people. And that's usually more in the sort of like fame spectrum. But this like famous celebrities are like not the wealthy in our societies. They are of a wealthier class, but nothing compared to the grand heights and how separated we are, whether then it goes on to like political power or like truly successful business people. People who are like owning small islands and this kind of thing. It's an incredible scale. Well, this was a lot of fun. I actually kind of enjoyed this time that we didn't have as many questions because it let us continue a conversation. This is a little perhaps more spicy than usual, but hey, it's my podcast, so we can talk about whatever I want here, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for tuning in. Big shout out to my patrons for your support. That's why the podcast is possible and continues, because you guys are amazing. I'm going to say one final teaser here at the end. I'm working with a graphic artist to perhaps finally create some merchandise late summer available for early fall that I'm really, really excited to do. And I think will be another like next extension of the channel, a way for people to be involved and support, and stuff that I can start, repping here on the channel as we continue with the podcast. But eternally grateful. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much for tuning in. Catch you in the next one.